Great, thanks, Tony. This is Bob Beal from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the American Lobster Management Board. The board chair is Pat Kelleher, as noted on the agenda, but Pat has been triple booked today with some legislative issues, so he's not going to be able to make this call. And currently there is not a vice chair to the board, so under the commission guidelines, the commission staff can step in and chair the board meeting in the absence of the chair and vice chair. So that's what I'll be doing today. With that, it's a pretty straightforward agenda, and I think we can move through it fairly easily. But are there any additional changes or additions to the agenda or anything else for the agenda? All right, hearing none, the board stands approved by board consent. The agenda stands approved by board consent. Is there any public comment for items that are not on the agenda? Not seeing any hands for public comment. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the meat of the agenda, which is considering draft addendum 30 for public comment. So with that, I'll ask Caitlin to run through a review of the addendum and its contents, and then we'll have an opportunity for comments and questions, and then consider board action. So with that, Caitlin, take it away, please.
Thank you, Mr. Substitute Chair. So I'm going to go through a quick presentation on draft addendum 30, and this should say 30, not 27, sorry. On the foreign import minimum size recommendation. This was discussed at the last board meeting, and the board initiated this addendum to clarify its intention regarding this issue. So the background on addendum 30 relates back to the approval of addendum 27, which established a series of management measures to protect the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank spawning stock biomass. And measures are triggered by an observed decline in a combined recruit abundance index to a threshold, which was met in the fall of last year. So under addendum 27 and the implementation date that was set by the board, this means the changes to the gauge and escape vent sizes in LCMA areas 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod will be initiated starting January 1st, 2025. This schedule shows the changes in measures for addendum 27, and the two yellow highlights are the increases in minimum size in 2025 and 2027 for LCMA 1. So these two changes are relevant for this document because they will be increasing the smallest minimum size for American lobster in the United States, and this change will thus have impacts to the size of live American lobster that will be allowed to be imported into the country. So as we discussed at the January board meeting, the Magnuson-Stevens Act includes the Mitchell provision, which prohibits the import and sale of lobsters smaller than the minimum possession size in effect under the Commission's FMP. And this provision was intended to prevent smaller lobster than what the U.S. industry can catch from coming into the U.S. market. So given that, the 2025 and 2027 changes in minimum size for LCMA 1 will also change the minimum size for lobster entering the U.S. under the Mitchell provision. So the purpose of draft addendum 30 is simply to clarify the Commission's intentions regarding recommendations to NOAA fisheries on how the gauge size changes in LCMA 1 would affect foreign import size restrictions under the Mitchell provision. And the draft addendum clarifies that the Commission would recommend to NOAA fisheries that when addendum 27 measures go into effect, imports from other countries would be restricted to the smallest LCMA minimum size in effect in any of the LCMAs, which will be 3 5/16 of an inch in 2025, and then 3 3/8 of an inch in 2027. And this is consistent with the intent of the Mitchell provision to limit live lobster imports into the U.S. to be no smaller than the smallest lobsters that can be legally landed by the U.S. industry. This is the timeline of development and next steps for draft addendum 30. So after the board initiated the addendum in January, the PDT developed the addendum document, and that's what's in front of the board today for consideration for public comment. And then the next step would be to hold a public comment period, and then for the board to review public comments and consider the addendum for final approval at its spring meeting. And after that, the commission's recommendation would be forwarded to NOAA Fisheries. So this is what the timeline would look like if we follow the typical process with a 30-day comment period. However, since the last board meeting, we've had a request from NOAA to extend the comment period to 60 days. So when I'm done with the presentation, I will go to Allie Murphy to speak to that. And with that information, this is the board action to be considered today. And that's whether there are any changes to the draft addendum needed, and then to consider approval of draft addendum 30 for public comment. And that is the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. As you mentioned, we've heard from NOAA that there may be justification for a longer than traditional public comment period. So with that, Allie, I'll take the privilege and put you on the spot if you want to comment on that. I know Chip Lynch is on, or it appears Chip Lynch is on this webinar as well. So I'll go to Allie, and then we'll go back to the board for questions and comments. So Allie, go ahead when you're ready.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So as this action has the potential to affect imports, me and other folks at NOAA Fisheries have been in touch with officials at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and we've had a number of conversations over the last few weeks. They've educated me and other NOAA Fisheries folks about how best to comply with the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade agreement, as well as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, or USMCA. And under these international agreements, the United States needs to provide 60 days for other nations to comment on measures that could impact trade. And this is done through a process at the World Trade Organization. So as Caitlin kind of outlined, the typical process is for 30 days, and we wanted to ask the board to consider a similar 60-day comment period on this action to align those two comment period processes.
Great, thanks, Allie. Allie, question for you. Will NOAA need more than 60 days in order to notify, World Trade Organization and the other folks that you've been talking to, for them to reach out to the other nations, and then still, after those communications happen, still have a 60-day comment period, or will a total of 60 days at ASMOC be enough? And before you answer, having a longer public comment period for the commission may be okay in that, in other words, if we do anything more than about 45 days, we're not going to be able to consider final approval of this document by the board at the spring meeting. So if we push this back to the August meeting, we do have the cushion of a fair amount of time if you feel that NOAA Fisheries interacting with the international trade groups will actually need more than 60 days to sort of complete all the communications and notifications of a public comment opportunity to the other nations. So do you have a perspective on 60 days or even a little bit longer?
I think if the board were willing to give us a little bit of additional wiggle room there, that would certainly be appreciated. But I don't think we're asking for several additional weeks. I think a couple of days might be helpful.
Great. Thank you. That's valuable. So where we are, let's go back to questions to Caitlin regarding the content of the addendum, and then if there are questions relative to this international trade question and public comment timeline, we'll tackle those next. So questions to Caitlin. I see Dan McKiernan and then Jason McNamee. Go ahead, Dan, please.
Thank you, Bob. I guess my question may be for Attorney Chip Lynch. I'm wondering if we could clarify the legal outcome of a board decision here. I guess I would describe within the lobster producing states, we would be enacting possession rules. So possession of undersized lobsters would be banned. But for those states from Vermont to California that don't have lobster fisheries, you know, I guess I'm looking for clarification about how those rules actually get enforced and what this vote means. And so just as a follow-up, does NOAA have to complete its own rulemaking in order for this to become a final rule at the federal level?
Great. Thanks, Dan. Caitlin or Allie or potentially even Chip Lynch, would any of you like to tackle Dan's question? Chip has his hand up. Let me go to Chip, and then I'll come to you, Jason McNamee. Go ahead, Chip.
Hi, everybody. Am I unmuted?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just absolutely terrible with technology. So Dan's question is good. The preliminary issue here is the vote going out to public comment, and that really doesn't impact anything, particularly if there's 60 days of public commentary with some wiggle room, a week or so, or on either end. The other question as to what would potentially happen at the ultimate or after the board vote, and assume for the sake of argument that the board approves addendum 30. We're in a little bit of a different place here from the typical lobster rulemakings. The typical lobster rulemakings historically have always been, for decades, have been under the Atlantic Coastal Act. We have here the so-called Mitchell Amendment, Mitchell provision, which was an amendment to the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which was an amendment, which was a reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So all of this is under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So the way in which the federal government would proceed to a rule is a little bit murky, and something that we're trying to, we're examining the congressional record from back in 1989 and 96 when these things were in place, to better decide that, to enact what kind of a rule we would need to enact. So Dan, I don't have a hard and fast answer just yet, but I'd like to think that we will very soon, and we would certainly be able to alert the board at that time.
All right, great. Thanks, Chip. There may be some follow-up questions, so don't go far. Jason McNamee, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So kind of coming into this meeting, a question of why status quo wasn't an option came up in some of the correspondence that I was having on this. And so Tony answered it, but I thought I'd bring it up here just to make sure the entire board kind of heard the response to that. So I'm just sort of offering the question of, we've got the one action proposed here, and there was just a question as to why status quo wasn't also an option. And so just wondering if Caitlin or Tony could respond to that.
Tony, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And, we tried to clarify that this was not your typical addendum process and the introduction of the document, just so that folks have that there. But this is more of a process type addendum versus a type of addendum that has different management options that we're taking forward to get people's opinions on. This is just transparency to make it very clear to the public that we are asking NOAA to implement the rules of the Mitchell provision. So that is status quo. There isn't another alternative to provide. So that was the rationale there.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Cherie, you have your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to get some clarification, maybe clean this document up for the public process. Under the public comment process and proposed timeline, the second to the last sentence, is the second increase January 1st, 2025 or 2027? Document that I have says 2025.
I'm looking at it, Cherie, and I think you're right that it should say 2027.
Okay. And then again, of course, we've got some of these addendum 27s that should be addendum 30s in the document. Is that right?
I'll take a look. Some of them are referring to addendum 27, but I'll make sure that each one is correct.
Okay, and one more. Under the introduction, again, the second to the last sentence, that first paragraph. In front of table 1, you have LCMA TO. That TO just doesn't make sense to me there. Should that just be taken out?
Sorry, Cherie, you said second to the last sentence in the introduction.
Yeah, the first paragraph under introduction, the second to the last sentence in that first paragraph. I think you just meant to end it with LCMA and then
Yes.
table 1.
Got it. Thank you.
And that was it for what I saw. Other than that, the document looked fine. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cherie. Any other comments or questions or comments on draft addendum 30? Jason has his hand back up. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, just one other thing that came up, and I'm just throwing this out there so other folks can think about this as well, but this may or may not interact with some of, so this is like imports, right, from another country, but we have in Rhode Island, and I'm guessing some other states have this as well, because there are differing gauge sizes between states, or have been in the past. We have a provision, and there's very few people that need it in Rhode Island, but we do issue like a couple of permits that allow a business to have some undersized lobsters that are coming in from Maine, for instance. So I just wanted to flag that this may not matter like what we're doing today, but it came up, and so I just wanted to kind of put that out there as something that we're looking at. I don't have anything. We're trying to sort out whether it matters or not in Rhode Island, and it'll probably depend on what happens with this when it's finalized. But that's it. I just wanted to flag that in case other folks need to think about that as well. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Great, thanks, Jay. Anyone else with questions or comments? Allie Murphy, go ahead.
Bob, can I just really quick say to Jason, since the minimum size in Maine will increase, that the allowance for the undersized lobster in your state would still be equal to that of the smallest minimum size within the United States. So it would still be that same size limit. So it wouldn't behave any differently than the rules are now. So I don't think it would have any sort of negative consequences, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tony. Ally, you still have a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm chewing a little bit on Dr. McNamee's comments about this action not having a no action alternative. And I guess from a process standpoint, taking this out to public comment without options in the document seems, I guess I know there's a point to having public comment, but without having options in the document, what is the public supposed to comment on?
Thanks, Ally. One of the options is if the public provides feedback and the board does not want to move forward with final approval of the draft addendum, that almost defaults to a status quo option. However, this, as Tony has said, this is a very unique document in that it's just really clarifying where the board is on minimum sizes for imports, and it doesn't really create new policy. It doesn't affect the ability for U.S. permit holders to harvest lobsters of any size. That's all been established through Addendum 27. So this is just a clarification and an interpretation of the Mitchell provision relative to what has occurred in Addendum 27. Tony or Caitlin, do you have anything to add to that?
And I guess, Bob, as I said before, this is status quo. There wouldn't be another alternative. The Mitchell provision is as it stands, so we wouldn't have an alternative to provide unless we were going to ask Congress to not enact the Mitchell provision, which I think would be a very different document.
Yeah, thanks. Chip's hand just went up, and Ally, yours is up. So maybe I'll go to Chip, then I'll come back to you if you have a comment, Ally. Chip.
I thank you for recognizing me. I have a question, and this really goes to the legal part of notice. I'm struggling a little bit here to understand what we are notifying. One of the aspects of the technical barriers to trade agreement is for the comment to be meaningful, and if the interpretation was that this is just sort of giving notice of what has already been established in 27, then that would not necessarily be meaningful comment, because then that would suggest that the import question has been decided. That's not what NOAA Fisheries memory is of 27. I thought 27 was, as Bob mentioned, 27 made it clear that U.S. harvesters were restricted to the newer size. That is a final action, but the lowest size in the plan was still at 3 1/4. I think NOAA thought, and that Addendum 30 was to clarify that the 3 1/4 size would now apply to imports as well. So if Addendum 30 did not pass, then the commission would, and I'm not saying what it is, I'm just telling you what NOAA's understanding is. If Addendum 30 did not pass, then the status of the plan would be U.S. harvesters restricted at 3 1/4, but at the new lower size or more restrictive size, but imports would be still allowed at 3 1/4 because that it was the nature of 27. So it's important to understand the legal status here, because we have a potential for, the last time the U.S. went up on the gauge, there was an international dispute, and we want to make sure that things are transparent and clear and comment is meaningful. And obviously, I don't think anybody would prefer that result here as well. So So my question is, is Noah's understanding correct?
If I could respond, Mr. Chair. Oh.
It was our understanding that the Mitchell provision says that it is the minimum size in effect, and 3 1/4 is not in effect anywhere in the United States after January 1, 2025. So 3 1/4 is no longer an option for a size limit in the FMP that is in effect. So we couldn't bring that to the table. So we were under the understanding that it wasn't clear in the previous addendum of what we would be recommending to NOAA in terms of the Mitchell provision, and that we needed to make sure that the public understood that we would be making this recommendation, and that it would be best to put an addendum forward to let the public know that this is indeed what we would be recommending to you all for the Mitchell provision, because it is the smallest minimum size in effect in the United States.
Caitlin, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just essentially going to say that what Tony said in my presentation at the January meeting, we posed the question to the board of how to interpret the addendum, because we weren't clear on that. So that's why the board initiated this addendum.
Chip, do you have any follow-up? Are you okay with where we are?
I'm just confused. The Mitchell provision says the smallest size possession. It doesn't say the smallest size harvest. And I think Noah's memory for when Addendum 27 was going out to public comment was that it was there was a decided point of going up on the gauge for harvest, but to specifically not go up on the gauge in the plan, because that would implicate and trigger the Mitchell provision. You can go up in harvesting and still not trigger the Mitchell provision, so long as the lowest in the plan is still at 3 1/4. I thought there were discussions had at that time, and that was the direction of the board. So I mean, it is what it is, but it seems very unclear, and it could create a dicey situation where where NOAA is being asked to provide and allow for 60 days of comment on something that has already been decided. And that's not our memory of what happened, I don't think.
So Chip, you're saying in order for these international conversations, or in order for, we'll call it Canada in this example, to have a meaningful comment, they have to have the opportunity to comment on a decision point, essentially, is what you're saying, rather than just having a default position.
Correct. And the decision point Canada wants to comment upon is whether or not the minimum size pertains to imports. And it was not notified on Addendum 27, but that was, again, NOAA's thinking was that was because Addendum 27 was increasing the gauge for US waters, and that it was specifically intended not to trigger the Mitchell provision. Now that Addendum 30 wants the Mitchell provision triggered, it would be appropriate to notify Canada at this point, because Canada can meaningfully potentially provide information that the board would deliberate upon when trying to make the decision as to whether or not this increase should pertain to imports as well.
All right. Thanks, Chip. So you're right. This is confusing, I think you said earlier. So Addendum 27 increase or has a series of increases that are scheduled once a trigger is met. And that trigger has been met, and now those increases take place. But Addendum 27, if I remember correctly, maintained the coast-wide minimum of 3 1/4. But so then we had a discrepancy between that coastwide minimum and the minimum size limit that would be in effect in all the lobster management areas between 3 1/4 and 3 5/16. So I guess where I think we are is this document is intending to clarify the difference between that 3 1/4 coastwide standard, and the 3 5/16 that's in effect. So I think that seems to be sort of the quote unquote decision point here, is that clarification between the coastwide standard and what the minimum size limit will be on January 1st, 2025. Does that help you out, Chip?
We're getting there, Bob.
Okay.
No, seriously, you are brilliant at bringing everybody together and clarifying this. But I think you hit the nub of the issue. And I think it even said this in draft addendum 30. The status quo is 3 1/4 as for in the plan. Now, all the areas have gone up beyond 3 1/4, but that right now it's 3 1/4 in the plan. Addendum 30 would then also bring the 3 1/4 in the plan up, consistent with where it is in all the areas, specifically area 1. That's the decision point. It's the point being that, and if I'm understanding you correctly, if you approve addendum 30 as written, then the Mitchell Act is triggered, and there would be an increased restriction on imports. If you do not choose to do addendum 30, then you've got 3 5/16 of an inch in the areas, but still 3 1/4 is the lowest in the plan, which would allow imports. So that gets back to Jason's comment earlier about the no action or status quo alternative, and whether it's in the document or not. What I'm starting to hear and I would agree with is that if the board chose not to do addendum 30, you would then have two minimum sizes in the plan. The lowest for harvest, which would be 3 5/16, and the lowest for imports, which would be 3 1/4. If you approve addendum 30, then the lowest for imports would then increase. And that is what you would be receiving public comment on, whether or not to increase that.
Okay. No, that's helpful, Chip. I think, as you said, I think we're getting there. Maybe I think we need to maybe have a staff quick conversation on our end. Is everyone okay with about a 5-minute pause, just so we can sort this out to make sure that we all know where we're going and we can describe it clearly, and we need to end up with a document that gives a quote unquote meaningful opportunity for comment from our international partners. So if it's okay with everyone, we'll take about a 5-minute break and we will be right back if that works. All right, everyone, we are back. Sorry for the 5-minute break taking about 15. My apologies. We are having some staff conversation as well as some conversations with NOAA on how to interpret what's going on here. So where we've ended up is that the simple side of it is, if addendum 30 passes, then the minimum size for imports will be 3 5/16, consistent with the minimum size that will be increasing in area 1. And if this document does not pass final vote at either the May or the August meeting, then we essentially will have to, then there will be a lack of clarity on what the minimum size for imports is, and we'll have to get together with the commission board again and NOAA and sort out exactly how the Mitchell provision will work and or be interpreted, and what the minimum size is in the fishery management plan and because there's a coastwide standard, then there'll be what's the minimum size that's in effect, and those two will differ. So that seems to be where we are. Again, recapping, if addendum 30 passes after public comment, then the minimum size is 3 5/16. If it doesn't, then we'll have to convene a meeting with NOAA Fisheries, ASMFC, and sort out exactly the interpretation of where we are. And then I figured that would bring at least one hand up. And Dan McKiernan, go ahead, please.
Bob, for purposes of clarity, would it make sense for this addendum to state clearly that the addendum 3 minimum size language is being replaced or is no longer valid? Because the addendum 3 language says the minimum size shall be no smaller than 3 1/4 inches, no lower than 3 1/4 inches. Does it make sense for this document to point back to that addendum 3 to nullify that?
Is that addendum 3 or amendment 3, Dan?
Amendment 3, Dan.
Amendment 3, you're right.
Yeah, I think the difficulty there is we have to do an amendment to modify that amendment is the problem we have. And that may be part of the follow-up conversation if this document were not to pass. So I guess, are there any other questions on where we've landed? I know it's complicated and nuanced, but I think the best thing to do potentially, you guys judge what is best. You're the board. One of the options moving forward is, take this document out for public comment, see what happens, see what we get from, Canada and any other international partners that care to comment, and get back together after a longer than usual public comment period and discuss our next steps as a board. Are folks willing to go down that path? I don't see any hands, so I'm not sure what to make of that. Dan, thank you for raising your hand.
Yes, I would be willing to go along with that suggestion, Bob.
Thanks, Dan. I have Megan and then Jason McNamee. Megan, go ahead.
Yep, just confirming that I'm also willing to go along with that suggestion. I guess maybe a question to you, Bob, just to clarify if this addendum is not passed, my understanding is that there's no clarity in the commission's recommendation to NOAA on how to implement the gauge size increase in Area 1. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think the gauge size increase for Area 1 will be, to me, that's clear. That goes up to 3 5/16 on the 1st of January 2025. But what happens with imports from Canada at the same time is where the lack of clarity is, if this does not pass.
Yes, okay. Thank you, I agree.
Does that work? Okay. All right, then I have Jason and then Cherie. Jason, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just quick supporting your suggestion, Bob. So I'm on board.
Bob, I don't know if you're muted, but I'm going up next. And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, New Hampshire supports this moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie. So where we are is I saw a couple more hands, but I think we should have a formal motion by the board. So if anyone's willing to do that, I think Caitlin may have one drafted, but let me go to John Maniscalco, and then I think I saw Ray Kane's hand, but John, I know yours is up, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm a little confused. Have we made it clear what the negative would be if we don't move forward in this way? I haven't heard a distinct negative, so I'd like a little clarification on that. Thank you.
John, are you asking what's the negative if we don't approve this for public comment and see what the public has to say.
Well, really, what's the negative associated with moving forward and gathering public comment on this?
Yeah,
I don't see that been raised.
Yeah, no, I'm just the board chair here. It's up to you guys, but I don't see a downside to taking it out and hearing what the public has to say, including Canada during that time period, then decide, should this be approved or do we need to go back to the drawing board, so to speak?
I may have a kind of answer to John's question.
And I would appreciate that from you, Caitlin, or any of the other board members. Thank you.
If I can speak to that, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I believe at the last board meeting, what I heard was that there's an interest from the board in clarifying that it is their intention to recommend that imports from other countries be restricted to the smallest LCMA minimum size in effect. So that's why this addendum was initiated. So if you don't approve this addendum, then the commission wouldn't be making that recommendation. And so we wouldn't be putting forward to NOAA what the commission's intent and desire is. I guess that's kind of how I understood it.
Great, that's helpful, Caitlin. John, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, again, I guess I'm wondering what negative there is to moving forward with putting this out for public comment. Is there something I'm missing, some hidden negative that if we put this out to public comment, we could trigger something, and we need the international response. So why not move forward? Has something been said, or someone thinking of a negative that hasn't been mentioned? So I haven't heard one. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I have not heard of one either. Ray Kane.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Chip and Ally for being on this call. So I have a comment and a question. My comment is I would support this to go out to the public to hear back from international concern. But in layman's terms, I'm going to have to go out and explain this to the harvesters. And once this kicks in January 1, the harvesters, their possession size will be 3 5/16, yet corporate America will be able to import product from other nations under that size, which would be detrimental to our harvesters. So that, as a layman, I think that's the best way to acknowledge and to get this across to harvesters. My question is, will this have to go before Congress, being how we're talking about the Mitchell bill? And if so, will ASMFC will Alex put together a group to go talk to our congressional people?
I may ask Chip to answer that question on congressional involvement. Go ahead, Chip.
And I can't really answer that. I mean, if Addendum 30 passes, then Ray's hypothetical here kind of goes away. If it doesn't pass, there's just so many variables. It's hard to answer. It's just hard to answer. And ultimately, what the ASMC wants to do would really be up to you all, what you wanted to do. I mean, NOAA can't advise you to lobby Congress. So it just seems as though there are so many permutations here in the variables that while I think it's good to have forethought and to really think about things, where things are moving in the future. What I'm hearing around the board is almost a consensus to move this out to public comment, and at least at that stage, that seems to be somewhat of a no-brainer. And depending on what is heard thereafter, some of your decision points may become more obvious to you all.
Great. Thanks, Chip. Yeah, I guess
Thank you, Chip.
right, another way to look at it is that, you know, if the size is increased to 5 16ths for imports through this addendum and then subsequent action by NOAA, there is no need for congressional action to change the import size. But if Congress want to get involved and do something different, then obviously they have every ability to do that. There's no obligation for congressional action to increase the import size if that's what comes out of the commission and NOAA's processes. Chip, do you still have your hand up, or is that from before?
Yes, thank you for that, Bob.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you for
Ray.
that, Bob, and thank you for that, Chip. I was thinking ahead here, so I can go out as in layman terms and explain it to the harvesters as such, 3 5/16, and hopefully the international size will be raised in addendum 30 because NOAA and both ASMFC agree to it.
Yep, that sounds good. All right, Caitlin, do you mind putting up the draft motion that you have, and then I'll ask for someone to raise their hand if they're willing to make that motion. I think it probably want to add as modified today, since Cherie had a couple of fixes that she suggested that were good. Is anyone willing to make the motion? I see Cherie's hand is raised to make the motion. Is that correct, Cherie?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is there a second? We've got a few of them. I saw Jason McNamee first, so Dr. McNamee seconds the motion. Cherie or Jason, would you like to provide any additional comment justifying approving this for public comment?
No, I think we have discussed it for all the justification that we need to move this forward and increase the length as needed under national and international rules.
Nothing additional from me either, Bob.
All right, great, thank you. Let me try something with this. Well, are there any other comments on the motion from the board members? Sorry. Not seeing any hands. Cherie, yours is still up from earlier, I believe. There you go. All right, not hearing any comments, and I feel we've talked about this for a bit now. I'll try this. Is there any opposition to approving addendum 30 for public comment as modified today? Please raise your hand. I see no hands. Are there any abstentions to approving any abstentions for the motion on the board? Sorry. Seeing no abstentions. Any null votes? No null votes. So the motion that's on the board passes by unanimous consent. And that brings us to the end of our agenda. I think, I guess the other remaining question is public comment period time. Is everyone okay? And I think we are, based on what the comments that have gone around the board saying we want to hear from our international partners here. Everyone is okay on extending the public comment period to 60 or 70 days to accommodate NOAA's notification, et cetera. Is there anyone who wants to comment on that, or anyone has concern with extending that? And what that would mean ultimately is this would come back before the management board at the August meeting rather than the spring meeting, which is April, May. Please raise your hand if you have any concerns with that timeline moving forward. I see no hands, so I think we are all set here. That brings us to other business. Is there anything else anyone wants to discuss relative to the American lobster fishery? I see no hands. So we are a few minutes past 3 o'clock, and I thank you all for your time. and appreciate everyone's willingness to work through this somewhat complicated and nuanced issue. And we'll see what we get from the public, and we will be back in touch at the August meeting. So thank you all for your time, and the board is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.